Truly is risen.
On this second Sunday of the bright week, on the Paschal time, we again hear the situation that occurred with Thomas when Christ came into the room where the apostles were gathered secretly, doors being shut, and Christ came through without having to open any doors or any of those sorts of things, showing the new body by which he was resurrected with. He appeared to the disciples, and Thomas, one of the apostles, was not there through God's providence. But the week after, he appeared, and the apostles told him about that they'd seen the resurrected Lord, Christ. And he asked the question which the others were not willing to ask, whether out of shame or whatever it was. The question being that unless he actually saw the wounds of Christ and touched them, he wasn't going to believe. Whether that was exactly true in his heart or not, you can talk about. Perhaps it was true that he didn't believe, but perhaps he did believe, and on account of the other apostles who were too afraid to ask that particular question, he asked so that all the others also might obtain that edification. Christ, of course, knew what he wanted to ask, and without saying anything, asked Thomas to come and touch his wounds. And Thomas makes a comment which is very, very relevant to, or so I should say, Christ makes a comment which is very relevant to us all, very relevant indeed. After Thomas had touched the wounds and believed, he said, "My Lord and my God." But Christ said to him, "Because you have seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they who did not see, yet believed. Blessed are they that did not see, yet believed." He did not bless Thomas for having seen those things, but he blessed those who did not see, yet believed. This reminds me a little of the time we read about the prodigal son, who, as you know, went off and basically lost the inheritance that he was given and fell into great want. Having come back, he was greeted by his father in full glory, but his older brother started to grumble, saying that my father has never given me these sorts of glorious things that he's given you. But his father said that you have always been with me, and therefore you've always had these things. There was no special reason for me to give them to you because you are of mine anyway. And this sort of blessing that Christ gives to us is the same, that those who belong to the sons and the daughters of Christ, to God, to the church, don't have to have various miraculous things shown to them because they already believe fully, they already understand, they already know, and they're the ones that are blessed. Time and time and time it's been proven that people who see miracles either don't accept them anyway, or they accept them for a little while and then they fall off again, and the whole thing becomes some sort of irrelevant situation for people to see what we call miracles. They don't necessarily change a person's heart. Sometimes they do, but in most cases they don't. The fact that the holy fire comes only on Orthodox Pascha and has been doing so for centuries in Jerusalem, and yet is seen by Jewish soldiers and policemen and various other people, that Muslims and whatever, that populate the sepulchre there, doesn't change their heart at all. So you see, the idea of miracles is not something that a genuine Christian asks for. They do not. By believing, that is the blessed state that we get. One of the questions that we often see, which go back to the week before when Christ was crucified, was the words that Christ uttered on the cross. He said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And people say, well, what does that mean that Christ is saying that? There are quite a few explanations. I'll give you just two of those, bearing in mind that this is not the complete thing. Those of you who read the Psalter, and I hope all of you do, particularly the Psalter from the Septuagint, which is the Orthodox Psalter, in Psalm 21, the very first verse starts, my God, attend unto me, why hast thou forsaken me? First verse of Psalm 21. According to secular numbering, it's Psalm 22, but according to the proper church numbering, it's Psalm 21. And that whole psalm brings forth many of the things that we hear during that reading about Christ's crucifixion. They have numbered all my bones, and they themselves have looked and stared at me. They have pierced my garments, parted my garments among themselves, and for vesture they have cast lots. All these things are captured in that one psalm. Remember that the Jewish synagogue and the prayers of Judaism, the Old Testament, were almost entirely of psalms, just as today in our daily services the Psalter is read right through each week and twice in a week during Great Lent, because it forms the basis of most of our services with those verses. It would only be natural that Christ, even though he was crucified and suffering, was praying. And what would he pray? The Psalms. So what they heard from him, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, was Psalm 21 and the rest of it. Why is that so unusual for somebody who's been on the cross and is, suffering and is having this time? What else would they be doing but praying? So you see, that is one very obvious example of why Christ said those words. The other thing that we can attach to this is the fact that Christ came to give salvation in two different quarters. The first one for the living, which he did by appearing on earth as a man, teaching the new covenant, giving the new sacraments, and then establishing the church at Pentecost for the living. But what about the repose? Since Adam fell, the law was that everybody goes to Hades, good or bad. In Hades was Abraham and Isaac and Solomon and David. All the great saints of the Old Testament were there. But they had to be pulled out. They had to be taken out of that situation because their life was righteous, and yet they were condemned to exist in Hades for centuries. Christ, knowing this and wanting to go to Hades, already some 3 hours on the cross, begs his Father, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And at that point he gives up his spirit. In other words, his Father answers him straight away. That great ambition to go there and pull out the righteous ones that have been waiting for all these centuries in Hades had to be redeemed and pulled out. And he gets this answer straight away by releasing his soul and going into Hades, the soul of a man, but also divine, which then wrecks up the hold that Hades has upon the righteous souls. And therefore that redemption and that salvation is performed twice, once for the living, once for the repose. Therefore, that's why we no longer fear death, because the righteous ones no longer go into that place of darkness that all the righteous did in the Old Testament times. Which becomes for us, of course, part of the dogma of salvation, part of our faith, that we no longer have to fear death and all those sorts of things. But to fear not to repent, fear not to strive to keep the commandments and the precepts that the church and Christ has given us to this day. That's the whole situation that we are left with once Christ has resurrected from the dead and once the church was given at Pentecost, which will happen in 50 days' time, as the Lord promised when he left the apostles after staying with them for some 40 days, teaching them all the details. You know, he was with them 40 days. They say like a boot camp, a theological boot camp, where they all got a good dose of how to run the church, how to serve, what to teach people, where to go, what are all the little bits and pieces of the things that are not mentioned specifically in the Gospels or in the Bible as such. He taught them all that. And St. John summarizes that at his very last verse of his Gospel when he says that Christ taught so much then that all the books in the world could not contain it. You see? So those people who think that only the Bible is the only word that we follow and nothing else, miss out on all these great other teachings that the church carries with us and shows us through the one holy Orthodox Church to this day. God help us in this Paschal period. Next week we celebrate what is anecdotally called the Orthodox Mother's Day, the myrrh-bearing women on the Sunday. God help us, preserve us, and protect us all. Christ is risen.
Truly he is risen.